So there's been this kind of issue in Vancouver for a while now. Residents of Vancouver of varying ethnicities um, have been concerned for a while that there's this process of rich Chinese investors coming and buying up all the property. Um, and then boosting the price of it, and then selling it off, or renting it at exorbitant prices, and all these kinds of things, right? Um, the result is that nobody can buy property there because the market prices are going through the roof, right? And they're trying to get the government involved, which is not something that a liberal government is going to do. Um, it's just not. They might put some restrictions on things like idling, but the idea, this is that the liberals are a market party, right? Now, they'll do some things like tax them or try to modify, incentivizing things or whatever to try to balance things out, right? But if you're looking for a party that has liberal views on property rights, you're walking into my world, and that's a good to the left of any major party in the industrialized world, really, to be honest with you. You're flirting with real socialism here. It's not clear that's what people actually want, but it seems to be what people are talking about, right? My take on this, even acknowledging that, in my world, property rights don't really exist. If Chinese investors want to come in and drive up property taxes, the truth is that benefits everybody in the long run. You just need to get those property taxes spent on transit options and real estate developers looking towards more modest developments. So people are saying, they're driving up the rent. Well, okay. What is it that the government can do to get property developers to build more units that are more affordable, right? And what is it that government can do to take the money from these higher or more valuable properties, to take the taxes and distribute it into these more affordable places, right? That's something the government, that a liberal government can do. The idea that the liberal government is going to say, something like step in and say, that you can't. Houses can only be worth like this much or something, or like it doesn't or there's like rules on foreign investment as though that's really the issue is where the money's coming from, and they can't just put the money in. Like it's you get a lot of things happen, right? If rich people want to come in and that's where they want to live and that's where they want to put the money in, then that's going to happen. And I don't. Nobody really benefits from trying to push back against that, because all you're doing is you're decreasing the wealth of everybody. Now, like I say, you have to put systems in place to distribute the wealth that provide compensation for people that are negatively affected by people's decisions, right? So I've never understood the arguments against gentrification. The focus should be on pushing governments to help people adapt to gentrification by ensuring the money gets redistributed fairly. So, what's happening in Vancouver is a little bit more of an exaggeration than your average kind of gentrification, right? What you're talking about in Vancouver is, houses going from $300,000 to $2 million, right? This is. The problem is that the middle class is now unaffordable, right? Like, we're not talking about low rent areas that are getting out of the means of the poor. We're talking about middle class areas that are becoming that are being taken over by the ultra rich, right? Um, and we're talking the ultra rich, houses that are worth millions of dollars. If we were talking about something that fits more of the sort of typical um, sort of footprint of gentrification, we would want to talk about, okay, well, and I think I went over this once before. Um, if somebody's going to come in and put a bunch of people that are at subsidized housing levels out of throw them out on the street so they can't afford the rent anymore, well then city council or the provincial government, the state government, um, or the federal government should step in and say, okay, if what you're doing is going to create this effect, then you should compensate for it by um, uh, putting money into new units for the people that are displaced. And we can do that either through tort law. I think that I think there's a valid use of tort law in an anarchist legal system, or we could just do it through taxing, right? Right. We could either, we could talk about direct compensation, meaning that you take the money and you give it directly to the people that are displaced. Maybe it's probably not the best idea, right? Because they probably don't have the resources to utilize that most effectively. Probably the better idea is to take the tax money and put it into subsidized housing, right? This is a different situation because we're talking about, like I say, houses that were middle class houses that you couldn't afford unless you were doing well in the first place, are now houses that only the elite can afford. But what that means is that if the property of a house goes from $200,000 to $2 million, that's a huge windfall in property taxes. The city really benefits from that, right? And especially if it's a whole neighborhood. So you're going to see humongous, windfalls for the city. And what are you really fighting against? Like, what is your argument really? Your argument is, okay, yeah, I'm poor, but I should have access to the beach. I mean, you don't really have a good argument, right? Or at least you don't have a good argument in a market system. In a market system, the people with the most money get what they want, and if you have less money, you don't get what you want, right? You would have to live in a less nice area because that's how the system works, right? But what is important there? I guess I'm not. I couldn't see myself fighting for real estate in that sense, right? I would rather see myself fighting for the construction of new developments that are more affordable. This idea that I should be able to afford a house in the neighborhood that I want. Well, that's not how a market system works. We'll bring you over here on our side. We don't like markets. We don't like property rights. We agree with you, but we agree with you by rejecting the basis of the society that we live in and arguing for a revolution. And that is what you're arguing for. If your argument is, I should have better access to this because I want it, well then, that's, you don't have an argument in a market system. You would need to argue for a revolution. And I'm not even sure that, over on my side, over here, we're going to say, well, do you need that house there? Why do you need that? Right? Do you have kids that need extra space? Do you have a disability that requires you to be a certain proximity from something? No, you just like the view? Well, maybe it's a better idea to, like I say, try to take that money that they're bringing into the city and spend it on, you know, doing things that will benefit you in that way, like a transit system, right? So maybe you're a little bit further from work because somebody with more money came in and, you know, kicked you out because they're higher in the hierarchy than you are. They make more money than you. They have a better job than you do. But then you can, you know, say, okay, you can take that extra tax money that they're bringing to the city. They can build a public Vancouver has a good public transit system, but you can, you know, strengthen the public transit system so that you can still get to work early or in a reasonable amount of time, right? Or maybe you can build bike lanes so you can bike to work. Or maybe you can build new developments that takes work closer to where you live. There's lots of options there, right? You know, but telling these people we don't want your money, I don't see where you're getting anywhere with that, right? Now that said, I do agree that there's no excuse for idle property, and I would support laws against idling property. So that means, you know, if somebody comes in and buys a property and just like doesn't do anything with it, right? And then, you know, the rents go up because they bought it for a certain amount and blah blah blah. That's bullshit, right? If you're gonna buy a lot, you should have to build something on it. And if you're gonna buy a building, then you should have to rent it, and etc. etc. And if it costs you money to fix it, then then you should either, you know, be fixing it or selling it, right? Just buying property and not doing anything with it is no good. And that's again, I have a long line of people that would all agree with me on my side of the spectrum on that point. Again, this is different than the kinds of anti-gentrification arguments that I'm used to having, because you're talking about, you know, middle class to, you know, elite, right? And it's really just people being upset that the place is being bought out by people that are better off than they are. And they're saying this isn't fair, they have more money than me. Like I say, hey, join the revolution, but it might not be really what you want either, right? You might just be an entitled piece of shit. But I've run into some anti-gentrification activists in Detroit, and they are pushing kind of the more typical gentrification arguments, right? Or anti-gentrification arguments. And when you have this discussion, I mean, it's basically the same disconnect, which is that they're not realizing that the increase in property taxes benefits them. But it's a little bit more real, because they're talking about people that are actually, you know, in dire straits, right? People that can't just move somewhere else because they need low rent housing, right? But when you argue with them, they just end up spinning themselves around in circles. So I might say something like, you realize that the source of the problem in Detroit is that the city has no tax base, right? And I say, yeah. Well, logically, then you must realize that the city should be doing everything it possibly can to bring its tax base back. Because, you know, if the problems they're having are that there is no tax base and they want to bring back their tax base, right? And they'll say, well, what they're doing is destroying the character of the city. Say, okay, but this character of the city you speak of is literally urban decay. The city's collapsing. And they agree. They'll say, yeah, we need to spend more on infrastructure. You know, our schools are falling apart. But the thing is, they're bankrupt. They don't have any money for these things because they're bankrupt, because they don't have a tax base. And they agree. Yeah. Okay, well, if we're going to build a tax base, we should be trying to attract wealthier people to the city, right? And then they say, no, they don't want wealthier people in the city because it'll change the city. They want to maintain a poor tax base, but they want to spend more money. As well, repeat, but the city's falling apart, guys. Like, shouldn't you want to bring more wealthy people in so that you can have more money to spend on things? I say, well, we should be spending more money. They agree with that, but I say, but you're bankrupt, and they say, yeah. And then I say, shouldn't you be trying to bring in property owners with more money? And then they say, no, because it's gonna, and we just end up in a back and forth that doesn't get anywhere. Eventually, I say, okay, all right, I get it, and I do get it, right? Gentrification destroys a neighborhood. Things change. It's different than it was before, right? And you don't want things to change because you're a fucking conservative. But so then why don't we take the money, take that tax money, right, and build new social housing with it? And they recoil. That's redistribution. That's communism. We gotta have that. And so now I'm the one that's confused. Although I'm not really confused. I know what I'm dealing with. I say, I thought you were an anarchist. And they say, oh, sure, I'm an anarchist, but you'll never get city council to agree with you. So it's not that they don't like redistribution. It's the city council will never agree, right? And then I have to, come to the conclusion and tell them that, okay, so your conclusion then is that rather trying to win an argument with city council, you're better off just barricading out all the rich people and, being happy in your poverty. And they say, no, if we spend more money on schools, that'll help us out of poverty. And then I promptly go looking for a wall so that I can bash my head against it. They'll never get anywhere with them. What they really want to do is they want to pluck the money off the trees and then use that to fix their crumbling cities without bringing any money in from the outside. They may present arguments that, the money is being mismanaged, and they might be right on some level. Okay. In Detroit, it's well understood that while the management has not been ideal, there's just no tax. They don't have enough. They're not able to tax people to pay for what they need. And so they find themselves really reliant on corporate, on surrounding corporations like the Illiches, because they don't have a tax base. But like I say, every time you try to bring that up with them, that if they would do things that would, coerce the wealthier people that live right on the other side of the city line. If you go to Ferndale or Ferndale is the one I know because Ferndale is really the only one I've been to, or Ann Arbor. Like if you go to these places, these are they're nice places. People with lots of money floating around. It's nothing falling apart out there. Brand new buildings, brand new roads, nightlife. If you would do things to try to maybe coerce them to move inside the city, so that they pay taxes inside the city. But they don't want that. They want the bourgeois assholes to stay outside the city. So are we gonna, are we gonna start, taking control of some of these factories? But no, they're not gonna do that either. They're gonna work through the bourgeois system without the bourgeois in it, right? Let's have a bourgeois system of government without a bourgeoisie. Yeah. And it's especially frustrating from over here in enlightened Canada, Canadians are the master race. We should all just accept that. We will take over the world eventually. Canada, or America, you're doomed. We will destroy you. Because we are the master race. Canada. It's especially frustrating from up here because we're used to this. Okay, we have social engineering at City Hall that designs our cities so that we have rich and poor mixed up all together. And we do it by taxing the rich to build low-income housing projects. We build neighborhoods with both types of housing integrated with each other. Not only is it not weird to us, it's expected, and we think it's weird that people don't think it's obvious. You will hear the odd grumble about how this is communism. It obviously isn't, right? But most of us not only don't mind, we understand that it's beneficial because we don't end up with these big neighborhoods full of poor people because we make sure it's all mixed up. And we make sure, and we accomplish it being all mixed up by actually distributing the wealth from the rich to the poor. So we don't have this debate about gentrification in the same way, right? Now, the language finds its way up here, right? And it gets thrown around, but it's usually very badly applied by people that don't really understand what they're saying, right? We get that a lot. It's the same thing as with the CRT, right? People start using critical race theory, and they talk about, how blacks have a history of. It's just not true. The only descendants of slaves that we have in Canada were brought over in the Underground Railroad, and there's very few of them, right? You just, I don't doubt the validity of the theory as it applies to Georgia or South Africa, but it doesn't really make any sense to Toronto, and you're not going to get anywhere by trying to apply it to Toronto. And likewise, when you talk about gentrification in Canada, you have to put it into context of the fact that it's a different country, and to the extreme discredit of Canada and Canadian academics. Okay, a lot of times they don't do that. They just pick up the language, they pick up the narrative, and they make no attempt to adjust it to a different country with a different culture, a different governing structure, and a different reality. So when you hear this, a lot of times it's just cluelessness, right? And it doesn't make any sense. The major reason it doesn't make any sense is because you're often talking about city-owned property. Because we have this in Canada. We have large amounts of housing that are owned by the city. And the fact that were previously owned by the federal government, but through a series of downsizing ended up owned by the city. So we're not talking about market rents. When we talk about gentrification in Canada, we're rarely talking about increases in market rents. What we're talking about instead is about the imposition of market rents. Because there weren't market rents there in the first place. The poor areas in Canada are generally not characterized by market rents. They're characterized by social subsidized housing. And when we have displacement, it's not because the rents are increasing. It's because the city is selling off property because they're not taking care of what they should be, right? And so when we are talking about market rents, the very rare circumstances that we are, the only reason why we are talking about that is because the city has a long way to get into subsidized housing, meaning that the city isn't doing what it's supposed to be doing. And the real solution in the Canadian context is that it's not that we need to stop development, but we need to boost it, right? The only reason why we're having this discussion is because the city has not built enough subsidized housing. If the city built enough subsidized housing, then the talk about market rents would not happen at all, except for people that just want to talk about, American problems in Canada without adjusting or even studying it. And you'll see this, right? You'll see people talking about issues in Canada cite statistics from New York or California, as though that's applicable, as though that's, and of course it isn't, right? Statistics for Los Angeles are meaningless in Toronto. They just are. And not in the sense that they're meaningless. Like, not in the sense that, like, if you're living in Los Angeles and you want statistics for, you might realize that statistics for New York are probably not going to work in Los Angeles just because they're really far away. Despite the fact that, the culture is not that different. The economic systems are broadly similar. It's not true in Toronto. If you want statistics for Toronto, you'd be better off getting statistics, or you want comparable, you'd be better off getting statistics from Stockholm. That's a better comparison. Or Geneva. Or maybe Glasgow. But not Los Angeles. It's just not good. But you see it all the time, right? And it takes a careful thinker to say, no, don't do that. It's bad methodology. So yeah, I mean, we get these debates, and they sound similar, but they shouldn't. And when they do, it's because people aren't thinking clearly, right? Bottom line is that anything that brings money into the city should be viewed positively. And if it creates, unintended consequences, it's up to the city council to adjust those consequences, not to try and reduce its own tax base, right?